This episode is brought to you by Philly Gemstones. The diamond diadem and Queen Mary's Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. I mean, those are the ones that we really recognise.
Yeah, even without realising, we have them in our purse and in our pocket, and we put stamps on letters, and most people probably don't even think about it, but there they are, and there these jewels will be for everyone to see. And they're both, I think they're just such fascinating jewels. I feel like I could talk about the diamond diadem literally all day.
Welcome to If Jewels Could Talk. I'm Carol Woolton, the voice of jewellery, an author, broadcaster, and the woman who initiated the role of jewellery editor at magazines like Tatler and British Vogue. This is a podcast for everyone, for people who do like jewellery, for people who don't realise they like jewellery, and anyone intrigued by fascinating facts, new ideas, and forgotten histories. So please join me as I tell sparkly tales, meeting all sorts of people, delving into 4 centuries of jewellery culture, and investigate what's happening now. This is Platinum Jubilee year for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. For anyone listening outside the UK, what this means is that the whole nation is celebrating her 70th year on the throne. And we're here today to talk about Her Majesty's jewels that are going to be exhibited this summer at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. Now, it's quite hard to talk about someone's life through their jewellery when there's quite so much of it. But we're very lucky to have here with us today art historian and curator Caroline de Guitaut, who is the Deputy Surveyor of the Queen's Works of Art, responsible for 700,000 works of art and jewels at 13 royal palaces, including Her Majesty's official residences, Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. And Caroline is responsible for the jewels in the exhibition and probably knows more about the jewellery than the royal family themselves, because she's had 30 years' experience in writing books and curating the royal collection. And she is going to give us a preview of the jewels on show this summer, their history and their personal relationship with the Queen. Caroline, thank you very much for joining us.
Carol, it's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
So, first thing, how did you select the jewels that are going to be shown?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's really a mixture of things, actually, but guided, I think, primarily by the themes of the displays that we are putting together. And so we have 3 displays which will be mounted at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and also at the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, the Queen's official residence in Scotland. And they will be on this summer for our visitors to see. And in London, we're really focusing on right at the beginning, the very beginning of the Queen's reign, so her accession, 1952. So we're going way, way, way back across the 7 decades. And what has really informed that selection of jewels is the photographs that we're going to be displaying alongside them. So the photographs kind of take the lead. And these were the first ever official portraits of Her Majesty the Queen, taken just a few weeks after the death of her father and therefore her accession. And they were taken by a leading female photographer called Dorothy Wilding. And the Queen posed in a variety of different outfits and of course with accompanying jewels. And it will be those jewels that visitors will see at Buckingham Palace. So that's the kind of reasoning behind that selection. And then in Windsor, we're going to be looking at the coronation, another, of course, incredibly historic moment, probably the most historic moment in the Queen's reign, and something that, well, I'm not quite old enough to remember, but many people in this country are still alive, remember that. And of course, it was such a historic and magnificent day in our nation's history. And there we are using the coronation dress, which, as you know, is embroidered with wonderful emblems.
By Norman Hartnell.
By Norman Hartnell and his wonderful couture house. And we're using that as the sort of guiding principle to inform the selection of jewels alongside pieces actually worn by Her Majesty on the day of her coronation.
I see. When I looked at the list, I wondered if there were the ones you'd chosen told the history of her reign, or the ones that she felt quite emotionally attached to?
Luckily enough, what you see in that selection, having said the sort of criteria and the background for making those specific selections, actually what we end up with across those two displays are pieces which, of course, are very frequently worn by the Queen, pieces that one imagines that she is particularly fond of, but pieces that have that great historic significance, whether just because of their, special nature as royal jewels. Some of them, of course, date back much earlier than her reign, but also significance in her own life. So I think that's a kind of combination of things, actually.
And did she approve the final list?
Yes, absolutely.
And she could do without those particular jewels for a little bit.
It's incredibly generous of Her Majesty, and we're always very, very grateful when she allows us to display these pieces, which is, it's quite rare, and it's very special to be able to do so. So inevitably, we're enormously grateful for her generosity.
And I thought the earliest one in her life seemed to be the Princess Elizabeth's coronet that she wore to her own parents' coronation.
Yes.
King George VI and Queen Elizabeth.
That's right, in May 1937, so again, going right back. And it's such a sort of simple object. It's something, it's a princess's coronet. It was made by Garrard & Co., and it's very humble. I mean, it's made of gilt metal. There are no stones. It's sort of embossed with repoussé relief shapes which replicate the gemstones that would have otherwise appeared on something more grand. And it's, of course, made in miniature to fit her head as an 11-year-old child. And she, of course, looked resplendent at the coronation, of course, accompanied by her younger sister, Princess Margaret, who wore, again, an even smaller version of the coronet and the beautiful lace and golden embellished dress and matching miniature coronation robes. And I think what's sort of significant about the piece, and in spite of the fact that it's, very humble, is it just marks, in a sense, that moment when, obviously with her King George VI's succession, after the abdication of his elder brother, the Queen, Princess Elizabeth as she was then, became heir presumptive. And that was quite a sort of defining moment, if you like, in her life.
And actually looking at the pictures of that, the photographs, it almost looks like she's a miniature version of her mother, kind of in waiting just to put on that more important crown in due course.
Absolutely. Well, of course, she had no idea when that was going to happen. And of course, sadly, it happened a lot sooner than anyone had imagined would be the case. But I think you're right. It's that wonderful, the beautiful portrait, also incidentally taken by Dorothy Wilding, who was commissioned to take those official portraits of George VI and Queen Elizabeth on Coronation Day. There's that lovely image of the four of them, the family, resplendent in their coronation outfits, and it's such... very kind of poignant in a way, actually.
I thought, actually, one of the most poignant for me was the lily brooch.
The flame lily.
The flame lily.
It's such a beautiful piece. And, of course, talking about that moment of Princess Elizabeth becoming queen, that was, as you're obviously alluding to, that was worn by Princess Elizabeth on her mourning clothes as she stepped off the aircraft, having, of course, had to return suddenly, unexpectedly from her tour. At that moment, of course, she had already become queen because her father had died. And it was interesting that she wore that piece, but I suppose because she was already in Africa, Rhodesia, it was appropriate to take with her on that tour. But it does have that extra poignancy, I suppose.
It's a very youthful piece as well, that befitted a young woman.
Absolutely.
But I guess it's the first jewel as a nation people saw her wear as the new queen.
Absolutely. So it has that kind of double sort of importance. And it had obviously originally been given to her as a 21st birthday present on that tour with her parents, which lasted from February to April 1947, one of those very long tours, not quite as long as the Queen's own coronation tour after her in 1953-4, but it was given to her then as a 21st birthday present. So I think it has that real sort of importance in her early life.
And then you've got two of the tiaras that are arguably most closely associated with her reign, the ones you see on her head on coinage, banknotes, postage stamps. The diamond diadem and Queen Mary's Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. I mean, those are the ones that we really recognise.
Yeah, They're so familiar, aren't they? I mean, we, even without realising, we have them in our purse and in our pocket, and we put stamps on letters, and most people probably don't even think about it, but there they are, and there these jewels will be for everyone to see. And they both have sort of really interesting histories, actually, as you know. I think they're just such fascinating jewels. I feel like I could talk about the diamond diadem literally all day, which obviously I won't, because that would probably get rather boring for your listeners. But
no, they're jewellery people. They'll be super happy.
The diadem is just fabulous, isn't it? It's just such a wonderful jewel. But I think what's in many ways surprising about it is that we think of it very much as you say, associated with the Queen, and we, worn on such important occasions. And it feels sort of feminine, therefore. I think we identify it as a feminine jewel. But it was made for a man. It was made for George IV. It was designed, as you know, originally for George IV's coronation, which was supposed to have taken place in 1820, but it all had to be postponed because of Caroline of Brunswick, his estranged wife, had come back, and there was the trial and all the proceedings taking place. So it was a very sort of stressful, difficult time. But nonetheless, George IV being George IV, and obviously hugely flamboyant, great lover of jewels, actually, and I think that's quite interesting from the sort of male perspective, had commissioned this extraordinary range of paraphernalia for his coronation. And of course, the crown jewellers at that time, Rundle, Bridge and Rundle, who were, must have been rubbing their hands together with glee at the amount of material that was required by the king. And of course, we ended up with this beautiful diadem, which was designed, we think it was designed by Philip Liebart, who was the leading designer working for Rundles at that time. And as you know, it's a combination of brilliant cut diamonds with those beautiful 2 rows of pearls around the band, enclosing this sort of waving line of diamonds. And then above, something completely different that no one had ever really seen before in such a regal piece of jewellery. And that is that between those traditional crosses, patties, so the cross-shape elements that we normally associate with a crown or a crown-like, sort of regal circlet, instead of being interspersed with fleur-de-lis, we actually have something completely new, which is these 4 patriotic devices, and they're made up of shamrocks, of thistles, and of roses, so obviously the emblems of Ireland, Scotland, and England. And so I think by doing that, what George IV was trying to, the sort of message he was giving out was reinforcing the Act of Union of 1800, which of course unified the United Kingdom. And he just didn't want the fleur-de-lis. I think the sort of anti-French feeling sort of came into that. So this was something really new. And those devices are set, they're open back settings, so it's quite modern in that sense. And it gives this wonderful kind of lightness, I think, to that circlet. And after all that trouble, 1,333 diamonds, 169 pearls, setting the jewel cost £290. And then the diamonds were actually loaned, and they were charged, Rundles charged the king £800 for the loan of the diamonds. And it was quite normal at that time for diamonds to be hired for coronations, because obviously the number of stones required was beyond even the wealth of the sovereign. And after all of that, the king wore such an enormous hat with huge ostrich feathers that it was virtually impossible to see the diadem on the journey from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey. Of course, we've had the opportunity to see.
Did people see it when he emerged?
Well, I don't really know if history relates. I think that there's just the visual representations of the procession. There's wonderful works in the print room at Windsor Castle, part of the Royal Collection, showing that huge coronation procession, and all you can see is the king resplendent in his robes, and then this enormous hat and feathers, and you need a sort of microscope to see the diadem. But he obviously liked it because he decided to keep it. And then it was worn by Queen Adelaide, consort of William IV, and then ultimately inherited by Queen Victoria in 1837. And it's then, been passed down generation to generation as a sort of heirloom jewel through the family. And actually thinking about the postage stamp thing with Her Majesty the Queen, actually Queen Victoria on the penny black stamp is depicted wearing the diadem. So there was a sort of precedent for that.
So the alterations would take place but never actually alter the diadem.
No, the diadem itself has been very little changed. I mean, I think just resizing probably of the band, obviously, to suit different head shapes over the generations. But as a jewel, the diamonds were kept. Obviously, I talked about the hire of the diamonds. They were kept, and it has remained as was.
So it was really from Queen Victoria that there was no more loaning of diamonds because there didn't need to be.
No, I mean, I think for coronations, obviously, there were certain new jewels produced for Queen Victoria's coronation, such as her coronation ring, because obviously she was the first female sovereign for quite a long time. And there wasn't an appropriate size ring, so a coronation ring was made for her. And with the crown jewels, obviously, there are, things change and are altered accordingly to suit and fit the sovereign, most importantly. But the diadem itself has remained almost intact.
But she had so many stones from South Africa, from India. So after the Hanoverians, they didn't need to rent anymore, did they?
No,
they had
exactly. There were lots of obviously these sort of tributes of empire, shall we say, and stones coming into possession. And Queen Victoria, like many other subsequent sovereigns, particularly someone like Queen Mary, who no doubt we'll talk about in a bit, had, no qualms, and it was perfectly legitimate for her to want to change jewels, which she often did, as you know. I mean, after the Hanoverian stones had to go back to the King of Hanover, her cousin, from Queen Charlotte's treasury. So that's when a lot of Queen Charlotte's jewels were sort of broken up and went. Queen Victoria had to replace a lot of things. So she would take stones from garter badges and from hilts of swords, and that's all recorded, of course, in the ledgers and in her inventory of jewels.
So there was a lot of recycling and upcycling and reuse of stones, and that still happens?
Not really so much today. I think there are a few examples in Her Majesty's reign where she's had obviously new pieces made, or she's adapted pieces that perhaps she's been given or inherited just to suit her. And I think the other element probably there is that fashion comes into play, changing fashions. And we definitely see elements of that, particularly with something like the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, which you mentioned a few minutes ago.
In fact, the Queen's collection hasn't changed that much, has it, according to fashion, in the last 70 years?
No, I don't. I mean, obviously there are pieces which are more of their era. I'm thinking of things that were presented at the beginning of her reign or things that were given to her as a young woman. She made changes to her 21st birthday diamonds, given by the government and people of South Africa. So she was prepared, I suppose, at that point to alter things to suit her requirements. But I think that's happened much less, as you say, during the 7 decades of the Queen's reign.
Do you think that's partly because she feels that they are for regal public display, and therefore people get used to seeing them in the incarnation they are in, and that's very important as a message of stability?
Yeah, I think there is something in that, but I also think that there's a great recognition of the history of many of the pieces that she's inherited, even if that's from her mother, Queen Elizabeth. So relative things that have come into personal ownership relatively, in relatively recent times, but certainly with things that have more historic, associations, things that belong to Queen Victoria or beyond. I think there's always been a desire to retain the integrity of those jewels. And then also I think that the other element is just thinking about pieces that Her Majesty has been presented with during her reign, particularly some of those emblematic jewels that are emblems of countries and things like that, and the thought that goes into the wearing of those and making sure that they're worn on those appropriate occasions and taken on tour, back in the days when Her Majesty used to travel so much.
I want to ask you something that I'm always intrigued by, and you can never quite find the answer to this, and however many books are written. How many tiaras are there?
I wish I could answer the question, but I actually don't know. I'm sure that it's possible to do a sort of mathematical calculation, and there are so many people out there who really watch this kind of thing, and I'm always sort of fascinated by that interest and sort of intrigue almost into things like how many tiaras, but I don't actually know, so that's hugely disappointing. I'm sorry to let you down, Carol, but
I mean, Susie Menkes, in her definitive book, Royal Jewels, said there are 11 tiaras frequently worn and a dozen more in store.
I mean, I just don't know quite where that number comes from. I mean, I think during the Queen's reign, we've obviously seen Her Majesty wear, a whole range of different tiaras, but equally, it's well known that there are others that she doesn't or hasn't particularly worn. Certainly not in public. Of course, we don't know for sure in private. But I think perhaps if you look at it from the other angle, it's sort of perhaps tempting to think, well, maybe those ones that we do see frequently are the ones that are comfortable to wear, that, Her Majesty feels are appropriate, and, the ones that perhaps she just likes.
There was a very sweet quote in Chips Cannon's diaries, which has just been re-edited and republished. And he said that at one party in Scotland, I think it was, he said, she turned around and said to him, "One can't really dance in a tiara." But you kind of imagine that the Queen could do anything in a tiara. She looks so comfortable in them.
Well, I suppose there's, the Queen's had quite a lot of practice. Yeah, I think certain tiaras are more comfortable than others, I'm sure. And when one thinks of the scale, some of them are really, quite big. Others are much lighter. And again, it all comes down to fashion and then, the sort of innovations of jewellery and changing materials, platinum and all that kind of thing coming into play.
Her sister, Princess Margaret, always said she's the only person in the world who can put on a tiara running down the stairs.
I think there's definitely probably a skill set there that has
practice
been honed over these many years.
So at Windsor and Buckingham Palace, it was really the division around the imagery and the dress.
Yes, exactly.
And so the coronation necklace would automatically go to Windsor because that was worn with the Norman Hartnell.
That's right.
Beautiful gown.
Yes.
That was hand-stitched with all the floral motifs from shamrocks and...
Daffodils. Well, not daffodils, actually. Not daffodils. Funny enough, leeks.
Leeks,
which is
from Wales.
And Hartnell particularly refers to how the Earl Marshal, who's obviously in charge of coordinating and organising the coronation, was most specific about the leeks, and that how he had to go off and send his team to research leeks, but he made them look very beautiful, actually, sprinkled with crystals on the coronation dress, so they don't really look like, well, they do look like leeks, but they're beautiful leeks.
Coronation leeks.
Coronation leeks, absolutely.
But that vision, that there's that moving image of her at the coronation with her maids of honour, and all you see is glitter and sparkle. It is incredible, and I think the impact of those royal diamonds just sort of ricochet around the world, and I think they sparked huge diamond trends in other places, in America with Harry Winston, and they all saw the impact of that.
Yeah.
And
just that in combination with Hartnell's dress, which itself is this tremendously sort of encrusted, glittering, incredible piece of design. And I think actually at the Queen's own suggestion, by including not just the emblems of the United Kingdom, but also the emblems of the nations of which the Queen was head of state and sovereign at that time. Obviously, some of those have changed in the intervening years. It gave this incredible liveliness to the iconography of the dress, which is just, incredible. And it's everything still looks so fresh today, even after all this time. And the Queen decided that those should include coloured threads. So, wattle is yellow, and, the maple leaves are green, and there's, pinks and things in the protea and so on. So there's this sort of freshness to it all. But as you say, in combination with the jewels, it was such a spectacle.
how's it stored? How is it kept so fresh?
It has its own dedicated proper conservation box, and it's very carefully looked after.
And must be heavy.
It is heavy, and actually Hartnell talks at length about how the head of the seamstress's workroom in his couture house had to really consider, with all that amazing embroidery encrusted over the dress, how would it behave when it was being worn, and how would that all be supported so that the dress would keep its shape during that 3.5 hour ceremony at Westminster Abbey. And the seamstress, head of the workroom, incorporated quite a lot of structure under the dress. So there's sort of horsehair, crinoline supports, particularly sort of around the hip. And that gives the dress that beautiful shape. And I think it was Cecil Beaton who described the Queen processing down the Abbey with the dress gently swaying, to and fro as she moved along the aisle. And, as you say, that sort of glittering spectacle altogether was quite remarkable.
I spoke to Anne Glenconner, who served as maid of honour at the coronation. And she said, on getting to the Abbey, there were two things she really noticed. That the Queen had to stand on a mark on the floor where they began, and she walked much quicker than the Duchess of Norfolk, who they'd been following in rehearsal. So they had to sort of quicken their step, and she said all she noticed was row upon row upon row of tiaras.
Yes, I can imagine. And then I think that the amazing thing is that the sort of wearing the tiara and then having to put the coronet on as well at the moment of crowning. It's so much going on, so much to remember, and the thought of all the guests having been there for so many hours before the 3.5-hour ceremony actually started. I mean, it must have been quite overwhelming. But we had the great opportunity actually back in 2013 for the 60th anniversary of the Queen's coronation, and I was able to reassemble all the maids of honour who were of course still all alive at that point, and we took a photograph exactly in the position where Beaton had taken his official portraits, obviously, unfortunately, on that occasion without the Queen, but it was just so lovely to hear all their stories. So fascinating.
Incredible.
Living history.
And apparently Cecil Beaton put sandwiches in his top hat because he knew he'd be hours in the Abbey and he'd get a bit hungry.
Yes, I think quite a few had ideas. I think there were quite a number of hip flasks and other...
The sandwiches secreted in various places. And it was cold, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was very cold.
Quite a miserable day.
Yes. Anne Glenconner said they were very cold. There was still rationing of fabric, and she said their dresses were very thin.
Yes. Well, Hartnell designed the whole lot. He did maids of honour, and of course Queen Elizabeth, Princess Margaret, Princess Alexandra, the whole family. He created that whole, really integrated design for how that coronation would look, almost, the whole look and feel of it. But yes, the maids of honour dresses were quite flimsy.
And every single aristocrat invited had gone to Garrard to have their tiara cleaned and repaired. And I imagine there was a bit of tiara wars across the aisle because probably people hadn't seen their family tiaras for some years. And I imagine them thinking, actually mine is looking pretty good in comparison to whose is the biggest.
I'm sure that was going on, yes. Tiara envy, probably, yeah.
So tell us about the coronation necklace. So that was Queen Victoria's.
So that was Queen Victoria's. So as we've talked about the Hanoverian stones having to go back, and so Queen Victoria commissioned Garrard's, obviously the crown jewellers, to make this necklace, collet necklace, to replace that missing jewel, because she'd often worn Queen Charlotte's diamond collet necklace. And so this was, essential for her. And the necklace has, as you know, a 22-carat diamond pendant suspended from it.
Huge.
Very large.
Absolutely
yes,
huge.
Yes. So R&S Garrard, yes, 1858. And of course, Queen Victoria was regularly depicted wearing that. She's wearing it in the state portrait by Winterhalter. And then the necklace, although obviously it's very much Queen Victoria's diamond collet necklace, it has been given this other identity, I suppose, by being called the coronation necklace, because as an heirloom jewel it passed down through the different members of the royal family and was worn to the coronation by the Queen's consort Alexandra, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and of course worn by Her Majesty for her own coronation in 1953.
Has it not been worn since?
That's a really interesting question. I think it probably has, probably on state occasions for state banquets and so on, but it tends to have that quite strong link to the coronation.
And talking about Queen Victoria, I was thinking, when we think about her jewellery, we do think about her really setting definitive fashions. Her tiaras and wreaths, and of course later on her mourning jewellery, and how she set the tone through aristocratic circles and everyone tried to emulate her. And then, of course, Queen Alexandra with her dog collar necklaces and chokers and the layering of pearls, different strands of pearls. I wonder, what do you think has been Queen Elizabeth II's fashion that she's set?
Obviously pearls. Pearls
I think so too.
Yeah. Pearls, I think are that perennial jewel that we almost always see the Queen wearing, on a daily basis. And I think the brooch has been a really perennial feature of the Queen's wearing of jewellery.
She does have that style, doesn't she? It's very definite pearls with the brooch, and it's that understated elegance.
Yes, it is. And some of those brooches, of course, are absolutely magnificent and very, as we were mentioning earlier, they sort of have a meaning. They have this kind of way of communicating with the audience. So if it's something like the diamond wattle brooch given on the Queen's first ever visit to Australia, if the Queen has been, back to Australia, or if she's hosting the Australian premiere, or some sort of occasion associated with that nation, she will wear the brooch, and that communicates a sort of message. It's without her really having to say anything.
It's sort of a great compliment, isn't it, to the nation she's visiting, or
Absolutely.
the foreign dignitary who is over here. But there's so much about brooches now, I cannot tell you. Everyone is now obsessed that anyone wearing a brooch is giving a message, a subliminal message. And they're all absolutely convinced that these are political messages. Now, I just don't feel that's the same with the Queen. I think she uses them thematically, as you've said. It's about paying compliments and being incredibly polite. I don't think there's a subliminal message more than that, is there?
I don't think so. I think that, obviously lots of, often things, people read things into trying to sort of interpret colours and, what do they mean and that kind of thing. And particularly in, I think, the more recent decades where the world seems to be so sort of politically charged and there's this instant communication, images pinging all around the place. And I think that it's overlaid with perhaps other people's interpretations, but I completely agree with you. I think it's more subtle than that. I think it's incredibly dignified, and I think it's very meant to be a very genuine and sort of heartfelt gesture of recognition of service of her people and the people of other nations of which the Queen is sovereign. I think it's really connected to that. It's sort of reflecting back almost. But I think that going back to your original question about what the Queen's sort of, in a sense, what's her sort of contribution to the kind of evolution of the fashion of jewellery. I think that those are sort of hallmark pieces, aren't they? The pearls and the brooch for day wear, and as we were saying earlier, a range of wonderful tiaras and necklaces, and it all, works so well together.
And with her colouring.
Yeah.
With her colouring.
Exactly. And the coloured stones, it's not just diamonds and pearls. I mean, coloured stones do feature. So
Not as much.
No, not as much, and I suppose
apart from the emeralds,
yes, well, the emeralds, some of which we're going to be displaying, absolutely,
yes.
Yeah. So in London, we've got the wonderful Cambridge emeralds, part of Queen Mary's Delhi Durbar parure, made in 1911 for the Durbar, which took place in Delhi, sort of marking that moment when King George V succeeded as King Emperor. What that resulted in was this incredible parure of jewellery made by Garrards, and which actually the King, in the end, presented to Queen Mary as a 44th birthday present, which I think is
not bad.
And so in terms of the some of the pieces that will be displayed, these will be actually at Buckingham Palace. We have the incredible Vladimir tiara, which, although it's not part of that parure, it can be hung with some of the Cambridge emeralds. And the Cambridge emeralds have such a great, really interesting story, having belonged to Queen Mary's grandmother, Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge. And then this extraordinary story about them being won in a lottery. And then
what is that story?
It's quite a complex
sort of
story.
German lottery.
Yes, and then
were they really?
Yes. Prince Francis of Teck, so Queen Mary's brother, then acquired them, and Queen Mary then ultimately, rather, I think, sensibly, acquired them from him, and of course used them to great effect in this incredible parure. And so we have the beautiful Delhi Durbar necklace, which I think is just such a wonderful design.
It's very modern, and that's the thing when you look at it now. There's nothing traditional about it at all.
I completely agree with you. I think it's one of the most modern necklaces with that asymmetric offsetting of colour and seven.
The Queen was doing asymmetric before all these contemporary people.
And I actually, when it was properly researched, the first time I ever saw that necklace, I thought, well, this has to be Cartier. It just felt like a Cartier jewel, that kind of really innovative design, pushing the boundaries of design. and it could almost be mid-20th century or later, but it's 1911, and it's so spectacular, so modern, and almost I find that it obviously designed to be worn with that parure, but it sort of sits by itself, so beautifully. And the incorporation of Cullinan 7 is, obviously gives us that wonderful link to the Cullinan stone, which is just, of mythical
one of the most famous diamonds in the world, the Cullinan. Yeah. And it was, what was it, 3,000 carats when it was found?
Yes, I think to be...
So big that mine owner, Sir Thomas Cullinan, threw it out of the window. He said, that can't be real, it's bogus, and chucked it away.
Exactly.
And someone had to run around and pick it up again and say, hold on, let's take another look.
It's such a great story. Yes, 3,106 metric carats to be precise. I think it's still, as far as I'm aware, I think it's still the largest diamond ever found. I don't think it's been surpassed. And as you say, the story is so fantastic. Rejecting it as being a crystal, it couldn't possibly be a diamond. But thank goodness that mine worker persisted. I think we have rather a lot to thank him for. And the stone, as you know, was finally presented to Edward VII as a birthday present for his 66th birthday, and of course sent off to Ashes of Amsterdam to be cut. And we ended up with those 9 incredible stones, 2, of course, the greater and lesser stars of Africa being part of the crown jewels, and then the 7 other stones incorporated largely into the Delhi Durbar parure, but other jewels as well. And Cullinan 7, as we were saying, is this beautiful marquise cut pendant stone.
And hung asymmetrically, so it hangs slightly lower, so you really notice it.
You really notice it, and it's offset by that single pendant emerald. And incorporated into the necklace are 9 further of the Cambridge emeralds, and those are interspersed with 6 very large, brilliant cut diamonds. So, I mean, it's spectacular on a number of levels. I think that necklace is really, really stunning.
The Queen has also commissioned Burmese ruby tiara from Garrard, didn't she?
Yes.
So would she go with a specific idea of what she wants, or would she hand the stones and say, come back with a design?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Certainly in terms of things that have been published so far about some of those jewels, and obviously given the archives, the relevant archives, we have a vague idea around some of the stones as to that dialogue. But I think it's very much a dialogue. And I think if you look back to, for example, Queen Elizabeth, so the Queen Mother's jewels, and some of the pieces that she was purchasing and having made, for example, at Cartier, there was a real dialogue going on there, and reuse and repurposing, as we were saying earlier, of stones, and making things that were absolutely to their requirements.
I suppose some of her most modern jewels came from Andrew Grima, didn't they? Or
yes.
Gifts from the Duke of Edinburgh.
Yes. And Grima, yes, and I absolutely love Andrew Grima. His pieces were just so popular at that time, weren't they? I mean, he was
sort of
so
60s modernist designer.
And the Queen has a beautiful brooch which was given to her by the Duke of Edinburgh from that collection when he was awarded with the Prince Philip Prize for Design. I forget the precise year now, but I think it was in the 60s, early 60s. And it's that wonderful ruby and gold brooch, which we still quite often see Her Majesty wearing.
Looking at the jewels, as I said, they're so ingrained in all of our collective consciousness as part of regal splendour and royalty and the sovereignty. It wouldn't really be possible for anyone in future generations to alter these to suit their own taste and style, do you think?
I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, I think some of the pieces that are clearly incredibly historic, it's fairly unlikely. And I think looking at pieces we were discussing earlier from in the Queen's reign, particularly pieces I think given by Queen Mary, who gave wonderful pieces for Princess Elizabeth's 18th birthday, and then of course particularly around the time of her 21st birthday, and of course at the time of her marriage to Prince Philip. Queen Mary gave so many jewels to Princess Elizabeth, and suddenly there was this abundance of pieces. But Queen Mary herself was had no qualms with altering jewels. And we were talking earlier about the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, just such a familiar jewel, but it's undergone so many different transformations in its history, mainly orchestrated by Queen Mary. I mean, she had the upper section detached from the lower bandeau so that it could be worn as a bandeau to suit those sort of very much more fashionable hairstyles in the first decades of the 20th century. It's difficult to predict, I think, what will happen in the future. But, the Duchess of Cornwall and even, the Duchess of Cambridge wear pieces which the Queen, has loaned them regularly, and they have remained intact in their original form. So
they certainly wear pieces that suit their styles very much. I think the big Delhi Durbar tiara looks fantastic on the Duchess of Cornwall, whereas the Lover's Knot is much sort of fresher and more youthful for the Duchess of Cambridge. So they certainly are selecting well.
Yes, I think that you're absolutely right. Those particular pieces seem to suit the sort of individual personality, very, very well.
And talking about Queen Mary, of course, she was a real jewel lover, didn't she? I mean, she just sort of overloaded it. It was complete excess of pearls and diamonds and jewels. And she obviously loved it. So maybe she had a vested interest in shifting them about and moving because she really loved wearing them. Do you think Queen Elizabeth has that same passion for jewellery?
One can see that there's this sort of strong parallel in a way between the way that the Queen wears jewels. I mean, obviously it's not quite to the same. It's not quite to the
different
same.
Era.
A different era, and it's not quite to the same. I don't particularly want to use the word excess because it sounds sort of gratuitous, but literally overload, as you say. Queen Mary had an absolute, remarkable talent for wearing more jewels than one could ever, possibly imagine. And but just carrying it off, and it somehow, when one looks at the photographs of her, I think, one just thinks that, oh, okay, that's just completely normal.
Yes.
That's what I suppose, because I spend a lot of time looking at these kinds of things, and I think, oh yes, no, that's Queen Mary, and that's absolutely fine. I mean, there's a wonderful portrait of her. I think it was for the first state opening of George V's reign, and the Queen Mary had Cullinan 1 and 2, i.e. the greater and lesser stars of Africa, removed so that she could wear them from the crown jewels. And she wore them as a brooch, and she wore Cullinan 3 and 4.
Oh my God.
From one of her 9 diamond collet necklaces. So altogether, I mean, she'd almost practically reunited the Cullinan diamond.
She almost had 3,000 carats. Kind of diamonds in depth.
Yes. The sort of... That was, that's a particular favourite photograph, actually. I think it shows how jewels can be worn.
I also think when I see pictures of her that she looked like she had this wonderful posture. She was very upright. And maybe that was because she had she was literally kept upright by so many jewels around her neck.
Yes. I think Chips Channon has one or two things to say about that, actually, in his diaries too. So if anyone wants to read up, I think he has some very good words and very amusing words to say about that. But going back to that sort of link between Queen Mary and Princess Elizabeth, I think there was a really strong bond actually between Princess and her grandmother, and I think they probably shared this mutual love and interest in jewellery, definitely.
And then you have the Queen's insignia of the Order of the Garter.
Yes.
Which that has to be a very important jewel to be shown. Where is that being shown? At Buckingham Palace?
That will be at Windsor Castle,
Because
of course it was worn on Coronation Day. And so the garter collar sits around, obviously in the usual position, worn for the coronation. That's the absolute sort of tradition. And the robe, the great robe of estate, which will also be on display at Windsor, has special fixing so that the collar sits correctly. And the Queen wears her father's garter collar, actually. So it originally belonged to King George VI. And so it's sort of proportionally, it seems to work incredibly well for Her Majesty. And then, of course, the Great George, that wonderful jewel.
And the Great George is made of, is that enamelled?
Gold, enamel, diamonds, completely set with diamonds as well.
St. George slaying the dragon.
That's right, yeah. So the
sort
of visual
absolute
embodiment
emblem of England.
Yes.
And there are 4 of these garter collars, aren't there?
There are many in the royal collection, but this is the Queen's, this is the one that was worn on Coronation Day, and I think that's what makes it so special.
And are there any that are being exhibited that haven't been exhibited before?
Yes, there are actually. So we are very lucky to have been able to display 4 relatively new brooches in the Queen's ownership, and these are a series of brooches replicating the emblems of the United Kingdom. So we have thistle, actually daffodil this time, not leek for Wales, and roses, and obviously shamrocks for Northern Ireland. And these are a set of 4 brooches. They're made by Asprey, and they were a Diamond Jubilee gift to the Queen in 2012 from the then Sultan of Oman, who actually died a couple of years ago. They are regularly worn by the Queen. She's worn a number of them for races at Ascot and that kind of thing, but they've never been exhibited. So I'm really excited to be able to show those.
And when you look at the whole collection, Caroline, what do you think the role of this jewellery collection is now? What do you think the role of jewellery plays for the Queen?
Well, it's an interesting one. I think it's just so bound up with the history of the monarchy, and the fact that the jewels are worn and appreciated and cared for and have this personal connection to successive generations of the family, I think is really important. And looking to the future, I'm excited to see how, in subsequent generations, if I'm around long enough, one will see them being worn by different members of the royal family in the future. But I think making that sort of distinction between, obviously, the crown jewels, which are completely separate, they're part of our, patrimony and our, national history, and worn on, just these extremely specific occasions. And then we see the personal jewels alongside. I think in that collection we see just this evolution of royal style, of largely British jewellery making, and so I think they seem to embody so much about the history of jewellery in this country.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us and for giving us a glimpse into Her Majesty's jewellery box and what we can go and see as the Jubilee year ensues, and what we can go and have a look at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. And of course we will be putting on Instagram as many of these images as we can. But mostly thank you very much, Caroline, for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Caroline. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. For more information about this and other episodes of If Jewels Could Talk, please go to our website, carolwoolton.com/podcasts. And if you like it, share it any way you can. And please subscribe to the podcast feed, which is on any of the usual platforms where you find your podcasts. And we'd love a rating and a comment. You can view all the jewellery we've spoken about at the Platinum Jubilee exhibitions. The Queen's Coronation exhibition at Windsor Castle runs from the 7th of July through to September the 26th. The Queen's Accession will be in the staterooms at Buckingham Palace, 22nd July to the 2nd of October. Go on the Royal Collection Trust website, rct.uk, to buy tickets. So thank you for listening. Please join us again in 2 weeks for the next Jewelled Nugget. We do have another If Jewels Could Talk exclusive for you. I don't believe, if you think about it, you could name a silversmith who became a global legend, but I will be talking about one. Viviana Toren Bulow-Huber, who was born in 1927, lived a groundbreaking life in every sense of the word. And we will be talking about that with her daughter, the musician Marcia Coleman. So please join us then. Goodbye. If Jewels Could Talk with Carol Woolton is produced by Natasha Cowan, music and editing by Tim Thornton, graphics by Scott Bentley, illustration by Jordi Labanda, and you can find me on Instagram at Carol Woolton.